I'd like now to say a few words about our speaker for this afternoon's session, and that is to introduce Admiral Bender, who is sitting at my right, and who is no stranger to many people in this room, although his background does differ quite a bit from that of the rest of the engineering types present. First, he can claim the distinction of being the first Floridian to graduate from the Coast Guard Academy, and secondly, he is an aviator. During his undergraduate years, he was both a member of the boxing squad and served as a humor editor of his cadet yearbook. He went on to win the Bronze Star Medal for his performance of duty during World War II. Most recently, he was awarded the Legion of Merit in recognition of distinguished services in his last 3 tours of duty. It is therefore my great pleasure to present the Commandant of the United States Coast Guard, Admiral Chester R. Bender, who will speak to us about Coast Guard protection of the marine environment. Admiral Bender.
Admiral Sonnenschein, distinguished representatives, authors, and moderators at the head table, members of the American Society of Naval Engineers, and distinguished guests. I am deeply appreciative of this opportunity to be a part of your annual meeting. I was also impressed with the validity of the theme that you've adopted for this year's meeting. The problems of the environment are indeed a challenge to the naval engineer. But you've met other challenges along the way, and I'm confident that your combined expertise and imaginative approaches will solve the environmental protection problems that face us today. I don't mean to imply, however, that we can dismiss these considerations with just a wave of the hand. We know that the problems have not arisen overnight and that they won't go away overnight. And to be realistic, we must also recognize that both at home and abroad, we're faced with mounting concern of an impatient public. Just a little over 2 weeks ago, Great Britain passed a law permitting the government to sink vessels which threaten the environment. Now, this legislation may seem a little severe, but when one considers the recent frequency of collisions and groundings in the busy English Channel, it is, I think, understandable, at least from a political standpoint. And here at home, we've seen the passage of the Water Quality Improvement Act of 1970. Under the terms of this act, the Congress declared it to be the policy of the United States that there will be no discharges of oil into or upon the navigable waters or the contiguous zone, which goes out to 12 miles. The law established an obligation to report each spill and provided a criminal penalty of up to $10,000 fine or 1 year's imprisonment for failure to report. The Act also provided a civil penalty of not more than $10,000 for anyone who knowingly discharges harmful quantities of oil. Another provision establishes liability for the cost of removal of oil spilled. And again, our President is empowered in a marine disaster to summarily remove and, if necessary, destroy any vessel threatening substantial pollution within our jurisdiction. I understand that Japan has also recently enacted stringent regulations governing similar incidents. In short, then, gentlemen, the message is loud and clear. The world in general, and in particular the American public, is no longer willing to see our rivers and oceans used for the disposal of oil, noxious substances, or sewage. And that applies equally to industry ashore, to maritime commerce, or public vessels of the United States. The recent defeat in Congress of the SST is a strong indication of public feeling regarding the environment. I personally feel the SST development program was quite sound, and it was, of course, strongly endorsed by the administration. Nevertheless, the possible threat to the environment was an important argument used against it. So it seems quite certain that at least in new construction, and most likely even in existing bottoms, the naval engineer will have to provide for effective environmental protection. This expression, environmental protection, has become a sort of a catchword in our society, but the Coast Guard has been involved in this important work for many years through the enforcement activities under the Refuse Act of 1899. Public awareness and concern have grown slowly over the years and have been reflected in gradually stricter legal requirements for water pollution control. Most recently, as I've indicated, Congress passed the Water Quality Improvement Act of 1970, which gives us expanded responsibilities in connection with the prevention, the control, and cleanup of pollutants. Recognizing, however, that ships alone are not always at fault, the new law also includes onshore and offshore facilities. Undoubtedly, major marine casualties that resulted in massive oil spills gave impetus to the establishment of these new legal requirements. The very well-publicized Torrey Canyon grounding, the grounding of the Ocean Eagle off Puerto Rico, and the major spills from offshore platforms at Santa Barbara and in the Gulf of Mexico all contributed to the growing public concern with the need for tighter regulations. Less obvious, but perhaps of even more concern to knowledgeable people, are the routine accidental spills as cargo is transferred between a vessel and a shore installation. We had one just within the past week, just 5 days ago out of Anacortes, Washington. Since much damage can be done by such spills, we have recently published regulations prescribing qualification standards for all personnel involved in transfer operations. Recognizing that pollution of the oceans is an international problem, the United States has taken the initiative in helping to attack pollution on a worldwide scale. The Coast Guard has been privileged to represent the United States at meetings of the Intergovernmental Maritime Consultative Organization, which is an arm of the United Nations. First, we're attempting to establish acceptable standards for the construction of tankers to minimize spills in the event of a casualty. Secondly, we're urging the adoption of a resolution which will require that all intentional oil discharges from vessels be ended within this decade. As you know, it has been common practice for tankers to flush their tanks offshore. Now, the amount of oil dumped overboard in a single operation of this type is not great, but the tremendous volume of oil commerce today, the large numbers of tankers, and the constant repetition of this practice has created what is certainly one of the major sources of ocean pollution. One authority has estimated that such intentional dumping may amount to as much as 2 million tons of oil annually. The San Francisco Bay collision in January caused a spill of 840,000 gallons of oil. The accumulation of oil dumped into the world's oceans because of tank cleaning equals 2 such massive spills every day of the year. If this pollution can be outlawed by the international maritime community, we will have made a huge stride forward in the protection of the ocean environment. As recently as March in London, our representatives on the Maritime Safety Committee of the Intergovernmental Maritime Consultative Organization succeeded in having such a resolution adopted. The next step, then, is to present the resolution for approval by the full organization. The likelihood of its acceptance and implementation looks very promising. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting here in Washington with representatives of government and shipping and the shipbuilding industries. And it was greatly encouraging when these leaders of industry not only concurred in the desirability of the goals that have been set, but also confirmed that they believe it possible that all intentional dumping would end within the decade. The Coast Guard's duties in the maritime field are primarily related to the safety of lives and property, and our search and rescue activities frequently result in dramatic news stories. So it's only natural then that most people think of us as simply a maritime rescue agency. But you people associated with the industry know that our interest in maritime safety is much broader, and that our primary concern is in preventing accidents rather than just picking up survivors. We are deeply involved with all aspects of maritime safety, the design of the vessel, the qualifications of the people who man it, and the safety equipment that's carried on board. Even the condition and operating practices of the ports become subjects of interest to us under our rather broad responsibilities. When, in spite of all these preventive measures, casualties do occur, we conduct investigations primarily to determine the causes and to prevent similar casualties in the future. Most of you, except maybe for the cadets and midshipmen, remember the Texas City disaster of 1947. You will recall that the fires and explosions at Texas City killed over 500 people and caused more than $50 million of property damage. The impact of such a tragedy captures headlines, and it's national news for a little while. But little known are the facts that face the Coast Guard daily, the facts that say emphatically to us, much is yet to be done in the field of maritime safety. The $50 million property damage at Texas City is certainly a staggering figure, and yet, in the last fiscal year, American marine casualties cost more than $97 million, nearly double the cost of Texas City. The loss of 500 lives at Texas City was tragic, yet in the last 3 years, marine casualties have taken a total of 535 lives. Well, these are statistics that remind us that we can't relax our safety efforts. None of us is certainly so callous to the loss of human life, nor so oblivious to the cost of damage, that we can be comfortable under these circumstances. Who among us would say, well, we can afford to pay for 2 Texas City disasters every year, or we can accept the loss of 500 lives every 3 years? I don't believe any of us would view such losses casually. So it's critical that we all work together to decrease and perhaps even someday to eliminate these unacceptable losses. We feel that one of the primary factors at work in this multifaceted safety program is the continued growth of waterborne commerce. And not only is commerce increasing, but the nature of cargoes seems to be growing more complex almost daily. And when you have congested ports and waterways, when traffic often moves through heavily populated areas, and when little is known about the interaction of one material to another or with the water environment through which it travels, today or tomorrow or next week could bring the tragedy we all seek to avoid. The Coast Guard is the Department of Transportation's main contact with the marine transportation industry. In the brief years that we've been part of the new department, some 4 years now, we have found it's quite beneficial to have under one roof agencies that are concerned with all modes of transportation. For one can't think today of a single mode of transportation without considering the others. Intermodal shipments are often required, and intermodal thinking is certainly mandatory. I can assure you that the Secretary of Transportation, John Volpe, has a keen interest in helping to solve the problems of maritime transportation, just as he is dedicated to better highways, improved railroads, and more efficient airways. With Secretary Volpe's support, we are seeking legislation in the present Congress to help us solve the problems that are identified in our investigations of marine casualties. That is, in fact, the prime purpose of our investigations. If we can find the cause of a casualty, we can then propose new systems, new techniques, or new safety measures that will reduce the likelihood of a similar casualty occurring again. But we can't confine our attention to yesterday's mistakes. We must also look to the future, anticipate industry and public requirements, and try to plan ahead. The pending Ports and Waterways Safety Bill of 1971 is an example, we believe, of looking to the future. Today, the Coast Guard is responsible for port safety under the Magnuson Act of 1950 and the supplementing executive order. Both of these authorities were essentially designed to provide port facilities or to protect the port facilities as an asset to national defense. The original emphasis then was on the prevention of sabotage. Today, the emphasis is on guarding the safety of the port from its self-created hazards. Industrial operations and concentrated traffic and prodigious movements of cargo, including chemicals and oils and other hazardous materials, combine to create conditions not encompassed by existing legislation. Also today, the only available sanctions are criminal penalties, which, frankly, we don't think are warranted in most cases. This proposed new act would authorize regulations to promote safety and thereby also prevent environmental or preserve environmental quality. It will provide the flexibility needed to deal with rapidly changing technology, new problems, and new ideas. Marine traffic systems are an example of the improvements that the Act could bring. We all recognize that waterborne traffic is expanding, and we encourage this expansion because it is beneficial to our economy. But by its very volume, this traffic creates safety hazards that can threaten our ships, the integrity of our ports, and the adjacent population, as well as even the whole environment. There are several different systems that might be used for this purpose. Each port presents a unique problem, and an effective system must be tailored to the specific requirements of the area. So it's quite likely that while we will see no single uniform system, the goal, which must always be the same, will be safe navigation through these areas of dense traffic. Now, in San Francisco Bay, we've been testing a harbor advisory radar system which shows considerable promise. The Coast Guard radars track the vessels entering and leaving the port, and through radio telephone communications relay information to the vessels, which cooperate voluntarily by reporting their movements. By providing advance information to the navigators in any weather conditions, such systems can help vessels safely through congested ports. In other areas, we're establishing sea lanes which prescribe a safe separation between traffic moving in opposite directions. Just as one-way traffic lanes separated by a wide median strip improve the safety record of our modern highways, so can well-defined sea lanes reduce the chance of collision in congested marine areas. We anticipate that because sea lanes have proven so effective in the reduction of casualties, additional traffic separation schemes will be established. Last year, more than one-half of all commercial vessel casualties were in inland waters. Many factors could account for these figures and these high losses. One factor that may be quite important would be the large number of tows that are operated by unlicensed pilot house operators. Legislation is pending then in Congress which would require towing vessels to be under the direction and control of a licensed operator. President Nixon has endorsed this concept and has said in a message to Congress, we must do everything we can to increase the margin of safety for maritime traffic. Another Department of Transportation sponsored bill, which we hope will pass this session of Congress, is the bill which would require the use of bridge-to-bridge radio telephones on all vessels navigating in U.S. waters. We know that lack of communications has been a contributing factor in numerous and costly tragedies. We're convinced that instant communications between approaching vessels can eliminate doubts and prevent many collisions. Delay in the passage of this bill can only invite further tragedies, like those that too often fill our casualty files. Two collisions in the Mississippi are good examples of what I refer to. In March of 1968, the African Star, downbound in the Mississippi River, met the upbound towing vessel Midwest Cities. The Midwest Cities was pushing two tank barges loaded with crude oil. A collision occurred, the primary cause of which was determined to be the failure of the two vessels to agree on a method of passing. Why was there failure to agree? Well, both vessels were equipped with radio telephones. Prior to the collision, the pilot aboard the African Star used his phone to try to contact the Midwest Cities, but there was no response. It was impossible for them to converse because each was on a separate frequency. 21 people perished in that fiery collision, 21 who might have lived if the vessels had been able to communicate by voice radio. About a year later, in April 1969, another spectacular collision occurred just upstream of the Greater New Orleans Bridge. The freighter Union Faith collided with one of three tank barges being pushed by the tug Warren Doucet. Again, the pilots had not adequately communicated their intentions. Again, both vessels were equipped with radio telephones on different frequencies. Again, the result was tragic. Two vessels sank and 25 people died in an accident that might very well have been avoided. Well, the Coast Guard certainly knows that accidents can't be legislated out of existence, but we realize, too, that preventive measures can be authorized by legislation to reduce the possibilities of further tragedies. We can't be content so long as the safety of lives or property are threatened as we believe they are today. Where will the next serious marine tragedy occur? New York? Mobile? Houston? Well, no one knows, of course, where this next casualty could occur, and no one can forecast what type of cargoes would be involved. But because of the large volume of petroleum products and other hazardous materials being transported in marine commerce, the chances are that there could be an explosion, a fire, or a massive pollution incident at any one of these ports. Fortunately, there was no loss of life when the Arizona Standard and the Oregon Standard collided near the Golden Gate Bridge in January of this year, but the spill of some 840,000 gallons of oil was certainly an environmental tragedy. As a result of the Coast Guard Board of Investigation in this case, each of the masters involved has been charged with negligence in the performance of duty. If these charges are proved, action could be taken to revoke their seamen's documents or take away their license. But certainly much more important than action against the master's licenses is to find out what we can do to prevent these casualties in the future. Currently, we're investigating a more recent tragedy, the loss of the Texaco Oklahoma off Cape Hatteras. 33 lives were lost when this tanker broke up and sank. Our Board of Investigation will attempt to discover how and why such a casualty can occur. One approach we are taking as a precautionary measure is to make a special examination of 13 tankers of the same class, which were also built about the same time. Again, in this case, aside from the tragic loss of all the deck officers and many crew members, a large amount of oil was released into the Atlantic. In spite of our best efforts at prevention, it's estimated there are as many as 10,000 polluting spills annually. About 10 of these spills only are likely to be of major proportions, and while most spills are relatively small, they are frequent and produce an unacceptable level of pollution. Also, of course, the frequency of the spills keeps public concern at a very high level. So in addition to the Coast Guard's preventive program, we've had to develop programs aimed at the containment and cleanup of spills that do occur. Perhaps you've already seen or read about our ADAPS, ADAPTS, ADAPT system. This is an air-deliverable anti-pollution transfer system, and it consists of pumps and transfer hoses and a large inflatable storage bags, and it's designed to be flown at short notice to an offshore tanker incident. The intention is to provide a capability for offloading enough oil to free a grounded tanker or to lower the level in a damaged and leaking tank. Well, once oil is spilled into the water, it must be confined in as small as area as possible if cleanup methods are to be effective. And while there are many oil containment booms now in the market, none has shown the capability of containment of oil in rough seas, offshore, that is. So one of our current research projects is to try to develop such a boom that can be rapidly deployed to a reported spill. We're testing a boom designed to operate efficiently in 5-foot seas and 20-mile-per-hour winds, and by late June of this year, we will conduct demonstration tests of this boom in the Gulf of Mexico. Other research and development projects which are currently underway include attempts to find better ways of cleaning up the spilled oil. In an age when we can build supertankers and produce oil in waters hundreds of feet deep, it just seems pretty ridiculous that our best means of removing oil from the water is to spread straw on it and then rake up the straw. Better means, we think, must be found, and we are pursuing this problem from several directions. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't touch on another aspect of pollution, the problem of control of sewage from vessels. The Water Quality Improvement Act requires that standards of performance be established by the Environmental Protection Agency. Once these standards are established, it will be the Coast Guard's responsibility to enforce the regulations. This aspect of the law will apply to all vessels, from small pleasure craft to large commercial vessels and to public vessels as well. This is one problem we can share with you because it'll be necessary to see that all of our ships are equipped with whatever sanitation devices can be developed. Naturally, this creation of standards is a complex problem, but it is clear the intent of Congress that both new and existing vessels be equipped to prevent the discharge of inadequately treated sewage into the navigable waters of the United States. While all of us are aware of the difficulties of complying with such a law, it is well to remind ourselves that public tolerance of marine sewage has pretty well reached its limit. Well, I've dealt today only with the problems of safety and the prevention of pollution. But I am firmly convinced that we can solve these problems by working together as partners with a common interest in the welfare of our nation. Each of us may have a different perspective, but all of us recognize, I think, the need for action. I have no doubt that the imaginative approach of naval engineers, combined with the dedication of the entire maritime community, will meet these challenges. Let me assure you that the Coast Guard will always work with you to achieve a safer, cleaner, and healthier environment, with no impairment of the strength of our maritime or naval forces. Thank you, gentlemen.